I'm Dana, and a little while ago I found out about the term glass child, which is predominantly used for children that are in a household where another child within the household, one of their siblings, has something going on, like some sort of illness, some sort of neurodivergency. They've got something happening, and the other children in the household become a little bit overlooked and a little bit left to the side. I won't lie to you, I haven't looked into the origins of it, but I've looked into what it is, and I feel like I have a good enough understanding to make a little video like this where we're not really focusing on the idea of glass children so much as we are the idea of children that were undiagnosed in a household with other children who were diagnosed, because I speak purely from my own experience, and that's the experience I had. I grew up with two brothers, and the eldest was diagnosed in childhood as being autistic, and I was diagnosed at like 22, 21. I was an adult when I was finally diagnosed as being autistic. So the first thing that I want to focus on for this video is the thing that made me really relate to the term glass child and the things that people were talking about under the term, which is that I often felt very overlooked and ignored by my parents. And it's something that I tried to talk to my mum about, and it didn't go that great, because for my family there was very much the idea of, because my brothers had different dads as well, my oldest brother was the poor little autistic kid that needed extra care and needed constant attention and, you know, needed to be loved properly so that he wouldn't turn out bad because he's autistic. So like he had a social worker and a lot of extra help in school and stuff like that, so my parents thought that they could just sort of like leave him to it because he had all of that extra support that the rest of us kids weren't getting, so he's fine. So my mum put all of her attention and effort into my middle brother and sort of expected my dad to do that for me, which he did for a fair while, but he also had a lot of mental health issues. So for the vast majority of my childhood and teenage years before he died, he was just sat in his office doing work and more often than not playing mahjong. So I didn't get that attention, you know? I didn't have any additional help in school. I didn't really feel like anybody gave that much of a shit about me as a kid. It felt like my brothers had a support system and had people that deeply cared about them, and I was just sort of doing my own thing and getting by on my own. And there were quite a lot of times that my middle brother was expected to look after me, because my brother's 8 and 9 years older than me, and I was just left to look after myself. He couldn't be bothered, he didn't want to, and my oldest brother was never expected to do anything because he was autistic. I'm gonna mention here as well that to this day he insists that he has Asperger's. He refuses to acknowledge it as like just the autism spectrum or whatever. He's very much like, no, I have Asperger's, I'm Aspergic. And that's what he was diagnosed with, to be fair. You know, it's up to him. The hardest part of my childhood looking back for me, and the thing that I definitely feel like the most resentment over and the most bitter about, was that so many of the traits that I had as an undiagnosed autistic child were the same traits as my brother. We did the same things. In a lot of ways we were very, very similar, and I was punished for it. I was told off for it. I was made to feel bad for it. I was made to feel as though I was lazy and incompetent and just stupid a lot of the time, or too much or dramatic, while my brother was taken care of and attempted to be understood and everything. Like, one of the big things growing up was that me and my brother both constantly had extremely messy rooms. And I still stand by it. Mine was not as bad, because mine was like, I've got clothes and toys everywhere, you know, it's just my belongings are everywhere instead of having a place. Whereas my brother's room was like that, with the added thing of like, oh, well, he fancied a midnight snack, but halfway through the sandwich he wasn't hungry anymore, so he just put it in a drawer and left it there for 6 months. And there's the multiple school lunches that he didn't want, and rather than take them out his bag and put them in the bin, he just took it out his bag and threw it in the corner. So there was just mouldy, it was vile, it was disgusting, it smelt bad. Like, my room was right next to his. I had to walk past his doorway to get into my room, and there would be like a passage of stench coming from his room, and he would be left to just do that for months and months on end before my mum would get really angry and be like, you need to tidy this, or we're just going to put it all in bin bags and get rid of it because it's disgusting. And that was when he would tidy it. I say that a lot of the time he wouldn't. It would be weeks and weeks of my mum shouting at him and making a whole thing out of it, and also shouting at me, until finally she would go and help him tidy it. Meanwhile, I just got screamed at and told I was being lazy, told that, like, you know, I should just tidy my room, and I'd be like, I don't know where to start. Like, you know, in the same way that my brother had the issues with knowing where to start and how to start tidying and how to do it, my mum would go in and help him with it, whereas I just got told that I should be able to do it and left to, you know, sit in my room for hours on end sobbing and crying until finally it was done. And my mum would be like, see, it wasn't that hard, was it? And I'd be like, yes, it was. It really was that hard. You know, and I was also a very like shy and anxious child, but I was constantly forced to hug people, greet people, say hello to uncle such and such, who was not my uncle. It was just some random old man in the village that's now kissing my face. And I didn't want to do any of that. I didn't want to be touched. I didn't want to say hi to people. You know, I quite often experienced not physically being able to speak to people, and my mum would just get really annoyed and be like, why are you being silly, why are you being stupid? Whereas if my brother didn't want to say hi to someone, oh, he doesn't need to, he's autistic. We can't like force him to say hi to someone. That'd be really mean for the little autistic boy. And it went for food as well. Like, my mum was not the best cook, and she would cook separate meals for my brother sometimes to make sure that they complied to his sensory needs. Whereas when I was sitting at the table sobbing and heaving and saying, I can't eat this, yes you can, you're just being fussy. And for me, that meant that I had a lot of fights and arguments with both my brothers, to be fair, but especially like my oldest brother is the one that I could not continue communicating with whatsoever once I became an adult, you know? Because anything that I did, despite being 9 years younger than him, was seen as me intentionally winding him up. I was just on purpose trying to distress this autistic boy. You know, any argument that we had, any fight that we had, was just assumed to be my fault because I must be riling the autistic person as an 8-year-old when they're 17. And of course, the thing that I think that honestly we see far too often within like neurodivergent circles, where parents don't want to in any way like punish or be like mean to their autistic kid. So my brother grew up knowing full well that like despite being significantly older than me, if I annoyed him in any way, he could scream at me and then grab my arm and bend it up my back like that. Like I can I don't know if this is just hypermobility, but like I can do that. Like I can connect my hands on this side, but nowhere near on this other side. And I genuinely think it might be because that's the arm that my brother always bent up my back in that kind of way. And I think it like stretched it out so I can reach further with that arm now than I can the other one. You know, like by the time I was like 8 or 9, he was already 6'2". Like he was a full grown man, and he'd bend my arm up my back, and my parents would walk it. Like he would do this in public. We'd be in shops and stuff, and he would bend my arm up my back for like anything I did to annoy him, even if I didn't know it was going to annoy him. You know, and I'd be screaming and crying, and I'd be in genuine pain. But what did I do to cause that? It was obviously my fault that he had to do that as an autistic person to make me stop doing whatever horrible thing I was doing to him. And obviously I don't have, like, you know, I don't maintain any relationship with any of my family members, but he was the first to go. He was the first that I was just like, I'm not talking to this man again. He is not my family. I don't want anything to do with him because he is a horrible person. You know, and even when I was like in my 20s saying this kind of thing to my mum, because she'd be like, oh, he's coming up to stay in a few days, and I'd be like, well, I'm not going to come over while he's here. And she'd get upset and she'd be like, oh, but he's your brother. And I'd be like, when has he treated me as a family member? You know, like all of my memories of him are horrible. It's him just being mean to me and getting away with it because he was autistic. Like he was at my mum's house when I got my autism diagnosis, and like we'd gone back to hers, and I was like, turns out I'm autistic too. And he was like, I'm not autistic, I'm Asperger. Autistic people are like this and this and this, whereas I'm clever. Like I'm just getting into my family issues now and why I don't like them. But I also think that he was sort of, you know, we're all to a point made into the people that we are by the way that we're raised and by the parents that we have and the like. And as much as we can educate ourselves and try to like be the best people we are and everything, I do think that he was, you know, created by my parents. He was created in an environment where anything he did was okay. Anything he felt like doing, anything he didn't want to do, it was all fine because he was autistic. He can't help anything that he ever does or anything that happens to him. It's just not his fault. You know, as much as I can blame him for not figuring that out and not being better, it's also like he's a product of where he came from, and you know, we're all that in our own different ways. As with a lot of autistic people though, he struggled to hold down jobs, he struggled to like remain in education and the like, and it meant that there was a huge amount of pressure for me to be the person that did education in the family, because my oldest brother wasn't going to be able to keep up with it. He was going to get overwhelmed, and it wasn't his fault. He was autistic, he just can't help it. And my middle brother was just never the academic type. He was like doing shit with his hands, he was into mechanics and things like that. He wasn't going to go to university, you know, there wasn't going to be any point. And that very much then fell onto me, because my dad was big into like knowledge is power, you need to be educated, and my mum had gone back to university as an adult and found that really difficult. So I felt a lot of pressure to be the person in the family that did well and went to university and got a real job and became like a career person. And for the longest time I wanted to be a doctor, and I think I was probably like 10 or 11 when I was like, there is no chance that I'm ever going to be able to be a doctor. Because growing up I was like the overachieving people pleaser, and I got good grades in primary school and like the first half of high school. I lived in a different country, it was a whole thing. But I predominantly got really good grades without really trying, you know? Like I always at least passed, if not getting a B or an A. And I didn't have to try, I didn't have to revise, I didn't have to study, I just went to class and listened to the teacher and then went to the exam and filled out what I knew and tended to do well. Which again is exactly how my older brother worked, but because there wasn't the label of autism for me, no one paid any attention to it. So when I got to be like 16, 17 and was dropping out of college and was being like just massively overwhelmed with absolutely everything in life and especially education, I felt like I was letting down my entire family. I felt like I was letting down like the thing my life had been like leading up to for my entire life, you know? I was going to be the one that was smart, I was going to be the one that was academic, I was going to be the one that went to university and my parents got to see me graduate and blah blah blah, and all of a sudden I was as much of a failure as my brothers, but they had reasons for it and I didn't. It's one of those things where like women in general and like people who are raised and socialised as women are generally diagnosed later in life than boys are. And then people, you know what I mean, the language is a lot, but you know what I mean. So I don't want to put it across as like if my brother hadn't existed or if like my parents had paid more attention or whatever else, then I definitely would have been diagnosed, because I don't think that's the case. But I do think that if I'd been in a family, even my own family, without the added barrier of someone who, you know, it just sounds horrible. That's the thing, is it's difficult to have these conversations because the hypotheticals always sound really horrible and probably to some point come down to eugenics, which I always obviously try to stay clear from. But in the hypothetical imaginings that we can do, I do think that I probably would have either been better supported or earlier diagnosed had I not had my older brother about being autistic and, you know, taking up the limelight, taking up the attention, taking up all of that. As well as, you know, for me personally, my brother definitely misrepresented a lot of autistic traits, and I have issues with my family, okay? But I do think that I probably would have at least got more support going through life had I not had an autistic older brother. You know, and that's not his fault. I was going to say it's not my parents' fault, but it is literally my parents' fault. And that's one of those things, I've had a lot of comments from people being like, you need to show more compassion for your parents. Like, I'm not saying they're bad people, I'm not saying they were the worst parents in the world, I'm not trying to shit on them realistically. I think that there's nothing wrong with acknowledging when people have made mistakes and that's what happened, you know? Like, I personally don't think I'm ever going to be a parent, because it's terrifying that you're going to be in such control of someone's development and life. Like, it's a horrifyingly massive ask, and I totally maybe don't understand it, but I can rationalise and like conceptualise that. So as much as like I am like my parents did this and this wrong, it's just the factual matter of it, you know? I don't really judge them either way for it. But there were a lot of things that they definitely could have done better and could have dealt with better. And I also, you know, like, so much of being diagnosed at the age that I was and everything for me was looking back on things and being like, oh, I could have done this and I could have done this and I could have done this if I'd only known, if I'd only had the support I needed, if I'd just had this and this. And it's just super fucking depressing to do. It doesn't help anything. But when it comes to making videos and the like, my experiences and the things that I think and whatever else might be able to help someone else to like figure something out or like, you know, put it together the pieces to help things click, whatever else. That's why I do this. So although it's not worth like sitting and thinking about on the average day to day, I do think it's important to think about the fact of like, if there are multiple children in a household and one of them's diagnosed with something that tends to be a genetic thing, maybe pay enough attention to your other kids to notice when they're massively struggling, maybe pay enough attention to your other kids to be able to support them through those struggles, you know, things like that. Maybe listen to them when they're telling you, hey, this thing actually is really difficult for me, instead of just being like, well, you did it, so it's not that hard. And also a bit of a disconnect from the actual video, but I also think that like abuse between siblings is massively overlooked and not really like talked about or thought about, or like, you know, so much of it's seen as just like siblings arguing, siblings being silly, and that was constant for me, despite the fact that I was being like really severely emotionally and physically hurt by my brothers. Like, it wasn't just a bit of sibling fun, I was significantly younger and smaller than them, and it wasn't fucking okay. But that's a different video. I just feel like, from what I've seen of people talking about being the glass child and experiencing that kind of childhood, I think that there's probably a lot more of us that were, you know, overlooked for our own like, traits of neurodivergency and whatever else, because all the attention was going on our sibling. And I think it's important, I found it very important for me to process and unpack, honestly, in like my whole like unmasking and autism general like figuring out life journey. You know, like, I think a lot of us look back on our childhoods and are like, why wasn't it noticed? And as much as it brought up a lot of like bitterness and resentment for me, it's also kind of nice to be able to look back and be like, this is part of why it wasn't noticed, this is part of what was going on. Like, there are reasons, and you know, I have a lot of black and white thinking. I like to know why things are and why, and I feel like that's helped me do that a little bit. And yeah, I just feel a bit soothed and comforted, and like I've been able to like process and get over some things from thinking like this and going through these things and like thinking about it in the way that I've just talked through it with you. And as always, I'm hoping it can be helpful to someone else. So if it has been, please do like and subscribe, and please do leave me a little comment. I'd love to hear about your childhood, your experiences with this kind of thing, your thoughts on it in general. I think this is actually the kind of conversation I would especially love to hear parents' perspectives. I know quite often I'm like, I don't want to hear from the parents of autistic people, you all annoy me. But you don't all annoy me, first off. But like, in a lot of ways, your opinions and experiences and thoughts are very, very important and can really be helpful. So I would love to especially hear from autistic parents, parents of autistic kids, whatever you've got going on. I just like having comments, I like having a conversation, I like having additional ideas to my thoughts and discussions, because I feel like I sort of come up with like my base thoughts, and then that's what I've got, you know. I don't really come up with anything else until someone else puts it in for me, and I don't like just having an echo chamber. So please do comment. If you want to follow me on TikTok, Twitter or Instagram, that'll all be linked down below. You can also become a YouTube member, and also linked down in the little Dropbox thing, I'll have my Ko-fi and Patreon. If you've got a little bit of extra cash and want to support me that way, but you don't have to, there's never any pressure. And most importantly, whoever you are, wherever you are, I hope you're having a lovely morning, evening, day, afternoon, week, month, year, and I'll see you again in a couple of days.